All right, welcome and hello. This is our pre-concert discussion accompanying Williamsburg Baroque's program, Deplorable Barbarism and Delightful Recreation, held as part of the 2026 Bloomington Early Music Festival. I'm Rebecca Bechtold from Wichita State University, and I'm here with the lovely Sophie Genevieve Lowe, a Baroque violinist, the artistic director of Williamsburg Baroque, and a writer for Early Music America. Let's go ahead and get started with our chat. Yeah. So the program title references a 1778 letter penned by Thomas Jefferson to Giovanni Fabroni, an Italian naturalist and politician. In the letter, Jefferson describes music to be the, quote, favorite passion of my soul. Yet he complains that fortune has cast his lot in a country where it is in a state of deplorable barbarism. So I think a good place to begin might be asking what led Jefferson to this conclusion, and do we think he's right? Sophie, what are your thoughts?
Strictly speaking, if we were to compare Italy to Tidewater, Virginia, in the late 18th century, there really wasn't a comparison between the composers, the musicians, even the instrument makers, the concert spaces. So I think in that aspect, Jefferson was right if he was just comparing that to Williamsburg. Also, at this time in music, Italy was really seen as the source of inspiration, even for music coming out of Great Britain. For example, Handel was very much influenced by the Italian style. So I think Jefferson was very cognizant that Italy was seen as this pinnacle of music that was happening at the time. Jefferson himself was a violinist. He said there were parts of his life where he would practice up to 2 hours a day. And we know from his library that exists today at Monticello that he had a wide range of music from Italy, from Vivaldi, Corelli, music by Geminiani. So Jefferson was very much aware of the level of playing that was happening in Italy, though he had not yet gone to Europe at this point. He was very much aware of the news that was coming out of that. In Williamsburg, there were two very prominent really people who were pushing the music, from Lord Dunmore, who was the governor prior to the Revolution, and we had the Carter family, who had a lot of music that was happening. So he was very much aware of sort of the standard that was happening. However, though, if you look at the perspective that just in the prior century, a few miles down from Williamsburg at Jamestown, in 1609, 1610, they were resorting to cannibalism just to survive. To go from that to the next century, where Jefferson's complaining about the level of music, it's a little bit unfair in some ways. And continuing in the letter, Jefferson also ends by asking if there was some Italians who might be persuaded to come to America, who had dual trades, who could do something, but also be musicians in America. So even in that note, I think Jefferson was in some ways predicting the immigrant school that would come, knowing that there were musicians that needed to be brought into really help establish Western music and bring up that talent and teach others. So even though he was very dismal, I think by the end of Jefferson's life, when you did have composers who were coming over and accomplishing different things, even the next year after Jefferson wrote this letter, Antis was writing to Benjamin Franklin in Paris saying, here's this new music. Can you get it played in Paris? I think Jefferson was just on the cusp of really exciting things happening in the American scene. It just hadn't quite happened yet.
And I think that's a good point. And something to keep in mind is that we were just a little bit behind in terms of music production. And part of it had to do with cost. Colonial presses did print music and increasingly printed things like songsters and metrical psalters and the like, but they weren't really trained in music production. So most music, from my understanding, was imported over from Europe. And I believe the same thing is true for music instruments too, making it a very expensive habit to cultivate. And isn't that one reason why John Antis is kind of an especially interesting figure because he made instruments too?
Absolutely. As you said, at this time, a lot of music, almost all of the instruments were starting to come over just from Europe. There was starting to be a rise of American instrumental makers like Antis. He's the first known luthier to make violin, viola, and cello that we know of. One of the exciting things about American colonial music history is there's always new discoveries being made about it. As of now, he's the earliest one. But as you said, he's really exciting because he's on this cup of this new musical frontier where he's composing. He's also making instruments. So that kind of really first generation of getting music production in America was happening right really when Jefferson was lamenting the state of music.
Do you think Jefferson was alone in his lamentations or his desire for, better music?
I don't think he was alone. I think if you look, he might have been the most extreme in his use of adjectives, but
Most
uh,
famous.
yes, of course. But I think that there was always this really need for music in colonial America, which was very, very exciting. We have a lot of records, as you said, of instruments coming over, and a wide range of people who had instruments, which is kind of interesting. It wasn't just the perceived elite of the society. There was a lot of different people who, from all classes, who we have records of them playing music. So I think there was always this desire. I think, especially in colonial America, they were always looking, to Europe to see like how far are we coming along, or, where they're trying to prove themselves as society. So I think one of the ways that helped rapidly speed up the production of music in America was that wanting to compete with Europe as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and I think what's particularly interesting is that, if you think about the transition from the 17th to the 18th century, a lot of religious churches did not include music instrumentation. They lined out their psalms instead of actually singing by note. That all changes in like the 1720s with the rise of, music singing schools.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I think we definitely see kind of an upward trajectory. But you see complaints about music even then. They described it as too much squeaking above and grumbling below, too much ornamentation. So it's really kind of fascinating to see that growth and those transformations that occur in the 18th century that eventually allowed for it to be a delightful recreation. Are there other things that kind of got us to that point in 1818? Is it mainly kind of the influx of the immigrant school that alters that musical landscape for us?
I think that definitely helped. Um, as I said, I think there was such a need for the young United States to prove themselves,
Mhm.
and that barometer against Great Britain was always, I think, on the forefront of their mind, and especially thinking about this sort of new national identity as well. As you mentioned, we had this rise of this sort of self-taught singing school. Really, the predominant figure of that was William Billings, who was at the forefront of really this new American school. And he was a self-taught musician. And so it's very interesting because you have kind of these two dual things happen that I think really started to make this American sound. You do have this self-taught, very much kind of, American, learn it yourself sort of thing that's coming on. And then you had this influx, especially of instrumental music, where it was still very much being influenced by Europe. So if you even look at what was being sold, for example, in different stores, we have a lot of treatises on how to play instruments, like Geminiani's The Art of Playing the Violin was actually readily available in the colonies, where when you would go to learn how to do singing, very much it was having these treatises that were by Americans. So you have these kind of very dual things where a lot of vocal music very much influenced by just American, a lot of the, as you said, a lot of religious different institutes, and then the instrumental music being very much influenced by Europe. And then you have that combination, and then you start to get this sort of new American, I think, sound that starts to occur that that's is something very new.
Yeah, and that might bring us to another question regarding the what we could expect to hear from your program. Like what set the immigrant school apart stylistically, or perhaps a better question might be, what should the audience be listening for? Are there things in the program that does sound specifically American, or is it kind of more reflective of those European, Italian traditions?
Yes, it depends a little bit on the composer. So when we have our British immigrant school, when we had people like Pelham and Taylor coming over, um, I think you can listen and hear that a lot of the instrumentation and the sound has more of a thinner sort of sound, almost like mid-century. They were definitely, though you don't hear it quite as much in some of their other pieces that we're not playing, they're very much influenced by Handel. So you definitely hear, like I said, some of that. Also, theater music was very influential to people like Taylor. He was very much working in London and like the Sadler Wells Theater, and so you have this sort of almost this little bit of this comical, I think, sort of sound that is coming up. Um, and then when you have some of our other immigrant schools, like you have the Moeller and Gahat, they have a little bit more influence where they were both. We know obviously Moeller was in Germany. We think that Gahat was in Germany as well. So you have this little bit more of this Germanic influence. You can notice from their music, I think their harmonies are maybe a little bit more interesting. The sound has a little bit more of a thicker sort of sound to it. So you can hear that sort of reflection in the music. But composers going over like Pelham, for example, his music does have this sort of sound where you can tell that he is very familiar, like with William Billings, and at least that American sort of school. So it's almost like when you listen to it, you're like, it kind of sounds like this, but not quite. I think there's a lot of moments where it sounds reminiscent of different music. Uh, in some of the quartets, you're just like, oh, this sounds maybe a little bit like Haydn. There, like you can definitely hear their influences, but like I said, you're like, this is something a little bit different, and especially in the immigrant school. People like Taylor and Selby, coming out of the UK, they very interestingly, though we're not playing in the program, they wrote a lot of patriotic, like American music, and so it's very kind of interesting to see just how they were trying to prove kind of their new identity in their new country, even in their music. Like I said, not on this program, but if audience members are intrigued to go on and listen to their styles, they can be on the lookout for that.
For what is distinctly American. And
Yes.
on that note, you're also doing Yankee Doodle, arranged with variations. Um, but the melody itself is not technically from the colonies, right? Or from the
No,
United States.
it is from Great Britain. So you still have this element where we just can't get away from it, even when we're trying to. So I think it's in American music you have like this early American music, even from the very start, you just have a reflection of so many different nationalities, so many different influences. And of course, that would go on to be what, our country would go on to be with many different people. So it's fun to see that, I think, in the music, very much reflective of so many different cultures right away.
Yeah, kind of the melting pot kind of concept and the
Absolutely.
diversity of America we already see in the 18th century emerge, which is awesome, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Maybe on that note, we could talk a little bit about your composition by Mariku, Black composer, came to the colonies as a slave before purchasing his freedom, I think you said in 1791.
Mhm.
Why is his crooked shank such an important part of this musical history?
Yes, I think it's so important because as I mentioned, we're always finding new discoveries, but at this point we think he's the first or one of the first Black composers to be published in North America. And I think he represents his life is just so phenomenal to see that he came out of just a situation that's just unimaginable, and he was able to do so much. But he was able to find his voice in a new country, and amongst horrible circumstances. And his piece, The Crooked Shanks, it's there's something so optimistic about it, and something just so full of life, that I think is really really inspiring. And I do hope that new scholarship can uh, find more of his compositions. We know that he did anthems. We know that he did other pieces as well. And obviously, for this sort of piece, it was meant to be just a fun, little country dance. So in some ways, it's a shame that I'm sure of all the pieces he's done, maybe it's one of the less serious ones. So it would be really fun to hear a piece that was like, for example, his anthem, where he was really pouring everything into his music. But I think he's in such an important figure just musically because he is representing other voices that were happening. It's obviously with the music that we're doing, we have this very sort of central focus on European music that was being supplemented, just because that's what a lot of the scholarship has shown so far. But there were certainly other voices, and there were certainly other people who were using that Western frame of music and composing their own style. So I think that it's a really important element, albeit quite short for what we have, but it is important to show that whole narrative of that early American music.
Yeah, and for me, I think what stands out is that he is adopting the jig sound.
Mhm.
Um, and so it's a recognizable tune in that sense, something in terms of that kind of European framework. But this was not uncommon for Black artists in the time period. We might think about someone like Phyllis Wheatley, who was an
Mhm.
African American poet. She wrote in a classical, very European kind of tradition as a way of showing her intellect. And it also reminds me how a lot of our accounts of African music and African American music tends to come from white listeners who always hear it as more noise than music.
Mhm.
So it's not surprising that there isn't something like distinctly African in his music, but it also is an interesting and important counter to kind of the white dominant narratives that we're getting produced in this time period.
Absolutely.
Um, So I assume it was a little bit tricky to kind of locate Mary Koo as the composer to Crooked Shanks, and you talked a little bit about his lost other works. Could you, as a way to kind of segue into our last question, but talk a little bit more about how Williamsburg Baroque is dedicated to the recovery and preservation of an early American repertoire that is not often heard or celebrated today. So could you maybe speak a little bit more to that mission, its importance, as well as some of the challenges you faced in your recovery efforts?
Yes. So one of the reasons I think that Williamsburg Baroque, we started off being interested in it, is that many of our concerts take place actually in the church where Peter Pelham was operating in, and he was holding a series of public concerts. The Pelham family famously is credited as being as one of the people who first did the first public concert. So already I think our minds were just very interested in this sort of niche part of American music. So a lot of our music comes really through kind of coming through rabbit holes where many times I'm researching something and I see one line about this person who is operating. I was like, oh, what are they doing there? For example, like Gahout, I just came across an advertisement of this violinist. I was like, oh, who is this? And I wrote it down and then looked up. I was like, oh, he's a composer. And so sometimes a lot of these things kind of come just very, like I said, this sort of randomly occurring. But I think it's always been important for us, as we're scheduling our Bach cantatas, to also be, we also try to, in all of our concerts, always have composers that the audience is probably never going to be familiar with beforehand. I hope they go away and they become more interested in it. But it's something that we like to do. We like to show just this range of different musicians and composers that we're operating and highlight that through our music. And so it's always been a great fun for us so far.
And where do you go to find the scores?
A lot of these scores we are very much indebted there's the IMSLP, it's the International Music Database, where it has like lots of random copies. Sometimes looking at things from different libraries will have different copies of the music. So it's always, as in early music, is always with its own challenges where we're reading offhand uh, hand copies or copies where sometimes things don't line up very well. And so sometimes in rehearsal we have to go through and we're like, just do you really mean this? Or did you really mean this? Or sometimes there'll be mistakes. So it's always a bit of an adventure, especially for some of these pieces that don't have recordings that we could at least find of them, especially of like the Cahat and the Mahler. So it is an adventure of adventure because we don't, for example, if you have like a Bach cantata, you can go and there's so many different interpretations and so many different things, and people have maybe even just this way that like this is the way it's supposed to sound. So it's fun for us to go in and feel like we're our own musical kind of pioneers going and resurrecting this music, but also having a really great feeling of responsibility, knowing that this might be the first time that this music has been played, in 100 years or so, and feeling the gravity of wanting to represent that composer well, especially if that's it's going to be people's first time hearing it. So it's always been a delightful recreation for
Yeah.
us.
Hopefully not deplorable barbarism.
Hopefully not, but the audience can decide for themselves.
So if audience wanted to hear more of this music, obviously they can tune into the early music festival in Bloomington, but like where else could they go to hear it? Do you have any other upcoming performances or where they can kind of track you as a group?
Yes, I'm very happy there has been this resurgence of interest in American music, especially this year. I know when I first did scholarship on Antis, no, I didn't meet anyone who had heard of Antis. I know I wasn't the only one, but I was not seeing his music scheduled anywhere, and now I'm seeing it all over different concerts. So hopefully audiences will see more of these composers start popping up. But for our group, we do have upcoming concerts coming up. We have one in June where we're just focusing on very much this American music as well. But if audiences wanted to follow us on our Williamsburg Baroque website, we also have upcoming projects where we are wanting to not only perform but record some more of this very early American music.
Excellent. So I think that's all that we have time for today, unless there's anything else you'd like to add.
No, that sounds great.
All right. So thank you for joining our conversation, and we hope anyone who's listening and watching will enjoy the festival and especially Williamsburg Baroque's performance. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.